Hello, I'm Chenoe Hart. As someone who has a background in architecture and is also interested in technology, I have frequently in conversations, it's come up as a conversation topic that people have asked me what I think about virtual and augmented reality. This lecture is an attempt to explore why I haven't been able to find an easy answer to that question. So if we look at some examples of how virtual and augmented reality are portrayed in popular culture, using the perhaps exaggerated case of stock photographs, you see either in this particular set of patterns, like oftentimes people will be wearing virtual reality headsets but still existing within a virtual world which fits within the existing paradigm of rectangular computer screens. So it's capable of operating in 3D, but they're still looking at a 2D screen like you would today. So that's one type of representation. And then in the other type, you have people navigating these kind of amorphous, vague fields of energy where we literally don't know what's going on. So in this respect, what virtual reality is currently what the medium is currently struggling with is similar to another historical challenge which happened to the medium of film. So this video should hopefully start playing. Yes. So around the turn of the century, many early films still operated within the paradigm of the previous medium of theater before we really understood how to make films. So there's an assumption where the camera is static. The position of the camera is no different from the position of a member of an audience in a theater. And you have scenes like objects and people going on and off of the frame of reference of the camera as though the proscenium arch of the theater is still present even though it's film. So the assumption is that there's still this static relationship. Now, if we skip ahead in film history, I'm sort of like overriding several decades, but like one example of kind of a recognizable, well-known film, but it's also like a very standard convention among many films is continuity editing, where, so I mean, this is from a Hitchcock movie, but it's like something that which you see in a lot of movies where you start off with the distance scale on the top left of the establishing shot showing you the city that you're in, and then the camera, which is now capable of being mobile, comes into these relationships with increasing close-ups of, like, well, in this case, the building where it's set, then people, then a close-up of like an object or some other detail. So the camera is a mobile device which can navigate between different scales and move through space in a manner which is somewhat closer in approximation to how people can move through space. We exist in 3D instead of flatland. And then in both those cases, I mean, film exhibits some similarities with centuries of architecture beforehand in the sense that there's processional continuity between different scales of space. So here, this is an example of a Palladian villa, but I could have used a lot of traditional buildings where the way that you travel through, the visitor into a building travels through space, through spaces of varying sizes between small spaces or large spaces, would create a sense of drama and procession, and the building is designed to some extent around this movement from like more large and monumental to more intimate spaces. And then but the difference between architecture and film is that film is capable of montage in order to compress space and time. So in this, another well-known film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, instead of showing the characters traveling around the globe by having a camera sit in a plane for 12 or 16 hours, instead you have a kind of campy animated map showing the plane traveling around the world. So it's like a well-known film convention that we cut through the boring moments of life with simplification. Architecture actually does this too, in the sense, at least if you interpret the theories of the architectural theorist Robin Evans, looking at the history of corridors and rooms where instead of the Palladian villa or other older buildings where you would have the building arranged as a sequence of rooms that you travel between, around Victorian times, the introduction of a corridor which can access individual rooms without having to travel between them like you would in a railroad apartment means that you don't have to access one room by walking through another room. So now you have increased notions of individual privacy and separations of different kinds of spaces. So in a sense, the room becomes a discrete spatial phenomenon, and the corridor operates as a kind of montage, which allows you to cut through spatial elements which previously had to be connected to each other. But then another method of spatial distortion happens in games where, so when you access a building in a game, and this will be a brief video clip, the room is a different size inside than it is in the outside of the building. And often, for instance, in the world map of a game, like the size of the people may not correspond with the size of the buildings, and they don't need to. Especially if you're accessing a room in a game, it may be a separate discrete file in the software compared with the file of the world map. So there's new types of spatial separation happening. These types of phenomena, as surreal as they might seem, also are reflected in psychogeographic studies of how people perceive space, in terms of the studies of cognitive mapping, where people are asked to draw representations of the spaces around them, which the results often end up not necessarily being like of accurate scale, where that's not particularly relevant to the psychological perceptions of the users drawing these maps. So in this example, like a basketball court is roughly the same size as a residential skyscraper, where it's exaggerated in scale because it's more important to the person drawing this map compared to a building which they've probably never been inside. So this type of spatial interpretation becomes subjective. This pattern is also reflected in video game design. So this is an example of a map created by the developers of a Metroid game, where there's large gaps in the map which might not necessarily exist in actual physical space because the developers are only drawing the part of the narrative which is important for their journey. And then another example from the Pokemon Red and Blue games of another map which again is drawn out more like a psychogeographic procession, which again cuts out a lot of elements of like the world beyond what is shown in the game. So in a way, that's another form of montage which happens in game design. And in this respect, when you see like certain moments in this map, if you look at the close-up view where there might be an awkward fence or barrier at the edge of the game designer's world, then in a way, that's a moment where the video game breaks the fourth wall. And over time, like game developers have done various types of tricks to make these barriers and edges more natural. But you can sometimes see evidence of these edges. This is also something which you see in the history of picturesque landscape design with, for instance, the ha-ha wall, where you would construct a barrier to prevent livestock from passing through, which would also not be visible as a barrier from the perspective of certain human observers. Similar narrative edges or abilities to disguise these edges can also be found in other types of game design. So here's an example from the game Myst, where because this was an earlier 3D game where the player didn't have 360-degree movement, but could only move in these prescribed directions, like a smaller range of prescribed directions. There's a path which it's physically impossible for the player to not leave as they travel forward, but the developers still constructed this barrier there to create the illusion that there's a reason why the movement is restricted instead of it being a software limitation. So they're trying to avoid breaking the fourth wall. And for a similar reason, missed in a lot of other early 3D games. I mean, another technique would be constructing the entire game world on islands so that you don't have to worry about rendering the edges of it, and it can be easier to make them seem natural instead of limited in their scope. So but game worlds can also engage in more deliberate types of impossibility, in the sense this was part of the MIT experiment with like a game called Common Tales, where I believe it was MIT, but I'd have to double check, but where like the entrances and exits to a room can teleport in ways that don't necessarily correspond with physical reality. And then another example of this in buildings occurs with elevators, where when you press a button to access a floor on an elevator, the floor ends up being an arbitrary numeric index where you don't necessarily need in the building to have a 13th floor if people are uncomfortable with that. So the floor is a social construct. And here's some other examples of building floors. And then here's the floor of like the new World Trade Center building, where I don't know if it's visible on the screen, but now that the elevator is literally a digital interface, certain floors have a lock icon over them as though they're inaccessible. A similar phenomenon happens when we travel on an interstate highway and we often end up finding ourselves possibly visiting familiar restaurants from other parts of suburbia, which are chain businesses with familiar brands. So in computer programming terms, a standardized chain restaurant could be an instance of a class where certain physical spaces are identically repeated, and they occupy a familiar part of our memory when we visit them. So traveling through these spaces does not add anything new to our memory of spatial geography, because that location in our memory overlaps with the location in our memory where we have memorized other previous spaces. I was inspired by these experiences of growing up in suburbia to develop in my recent master's thesis, which this is an excerpt from, a scenario in which automated vehicles would blur the distinctions between vehicles and buildings. So they would essentially operate as horizontal elevators. And the distinction between traveling within, so if like a building is composed of multiple automated pods which can travel and leave, then the distinction between traveling in a vehicle between buildings and traveling in an elevator between discrete isolated floors within a single building would be eliminated, and you'd be in constant motion without necessarily knowing or needing to know where you were. In the interest of time, I'll move forward. Here are some examples of, for instance, of how a garage could be like occupy different functions at different in different like time periods depending on what a user wanted. And then finally, this was a conceptual drawing which I developed showing a person's journey throughout the commute of their workday. And so it's shown as though like it's a section which wouldn't literally exist, but would exist from the point of view of a user, where they wake up in one pod and then it travels to connect to another pod. And then these correspond to different areas on the map, like showing how they perceive their experience as walking through a single building, which is composed of different buildings which would be incidentally connected to each other at different points in time. So perceived physical space no longer corresponds to constant locations in time. Thank you.